In the heavy silence of a forgotten bedroom, where dust motes danced like ghosts in the slivers of moonlight piercing boarded-up windows, 11-year-old Connor Miller sat on the edge of a small, creaking bed. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and decay, a smell that clung to the dinosaur-patterned sheets and faded posters on the walls. Curled beside him, his 7-year-old brother, Liam breathed the deep, even breaths of exhausted sleep, oblivious to the world that had cast them out. In Connor's trembling hands, he held a leather-bound diary, its pages filled with the elegant, looping cursive of a boy from another time. As he read the words written in 1996, a profound sorrow welled up inside him, and silent, heavy tears began to trace clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. They were not tears for his own fear or hunger, but for a loneliness he recognized, with an ache so deep it felt like his own, a shared heartbreak that defied the years separating two lost boys. This is a story about the kind of quiet courage that goes unseen and the promises that are kept in the dark. It's about realizing you are not alone, even when the world has forgotten you exist. If this journey already speaks to a part of your heart, please let us know where you're listening from in the comments below. Your presence here, marked by a simple like or by subscribing to our community, helps these stories find the people who need to hear them most. I can assure you, the path that led these two brothers to this dusty, moonlit room is one you will want to follow until the very end, because it reveals a truth about human kindness that is rarely seen but desperately needed. But to understand why the diary of a wealthy child, discovered in the ruins of an abandoned mansion, held the power to shatter an 11-year-old fugitive's composure, we must travel back in time. This moment of quiet grief was not the beginning of their ordeal, but a destination reached after a desperate flight. The real story begins 5 days earlier, on a deceptively normal Thursday afternoon. It begins in a cramped apartment far from these opulent hills, with the sound of a phone call that Connor was never meant to overhear, a conversation that would destroy the last remnants of his world and force him to become the protector his little brother no longer had. 5 days before he would find himself in the ghostly silence of the Whitmore Mansion, Connor Miller's world was small, cramped, and smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke and bleach. His life was a rigid repeating loop, a series of tasks dictated not by the whims of an 11-year-old boy, but by the stark necessities of survival. The Thursday that would shatter everything began like all the others, with the shrill digital beep of an alarm clock at 5:30 in the morning. The sun was still a distant promise over the grey rooftops of Gresham, and the thin carpet of their shared bedroom felt cold and rough beneath his bare feet. In the bed across the small room, his 7-year-old brother Liam slept on, his small form a gentle rise and fall under a thin blanket. For a fleeting moment, Connor allowed himself to just watch him, feeling the familiar fierce ache of protectiveness that had become the central pillar of his existence. This quiet moment was a stolen luxury before the day's relentless machinery began to grind. His first duty was in the kitchen, a cramped space where peeling linoleum curled at the edges and a perpetual dimness clung to the corners. He moved with a practiced economy of motion, pulling the carton of milk from the refrigerator, mentally calculating how much they could use to make it last until Derek's next grocery run. He knew how to make the bread, already a few days old, seem fresher by toasting it just right. He worked in a profound silence, broken only by the hum of the aging refrigerator and the distant rumble of the first Max train of the day. This was his domain, not by choice but by a slow, creeping abdication of responsibility from the two adults who were supposed to be their guardians. For the past 2 years, since the blinding snowstorm on Interstate 84 had stolen their parents, this kitchen had become his proving ground, the place where he fought back against the encroaching chaos with toast, cereal, and carefully measured glasses of milk. After setting out Liam's breakfast, he would gently wake his brother. This was the one part of his morning routine that felt like it belonged to him, a genuine moment of connection that wasn't a chore. He would shake Liam's shoulder softly, his voice a low murmur, a stark contrast to the loud, indifferent tones that usually filled the apartment. He helped him get dressed, made sure his face was clean, and checked that his backpack was zipped. Liam, with his wide, trusting eyes, never questioned why it was always Connor, not their uncle, who did these things. To him, Connor was a constant, a sun in his small universe. He held his older brother's hand as they ate, his small legs dangling from the chair, completely unaware of the immense weight resting on Connor's narrow shoulders. He was shielded from the neglect by his brother's unwavering love, a shield Connor was determined would never break. The apartment itself was a testament to the neglect they endured. Derek and his girlfriend Amber were ghosts in their lives, present only through the evidence they left behind. Overflowing ashtrays on the coffee table, empty beer bottles by the couch, and the perpetual drone of the television that served as the apartment's heartbeat. They were their legal guardians, a fact that existed on a piece of paper somewhere but held no meaning in the day-to-day reality of the boys' lives. Derek had taken them in with a sigh of weary obligation, and that obligation had quickly curdled into resentment. He and Amber existed in a separate world within the same four walls, a world of late nights, loud arguments muffled by their bedroom door, and a complete staggering indifference to the two children they were responsible for. Connor learned early on to be invisible, to keep himself and Liam out of their way, to make them so easy to care for that they required no care at all. The walk to Liam's elementary school was a brief 20-minute escape into a world that felt almost normal. They would join the stream of other parents and children, and for a few precious blocks, Connor could pretend he was just another big brother. He would listen to Liam chatter about his friends or a cartoon he'd seen, the crisp morning air a temporary antidote to the stuffiness of the apartment. But the illusion always shattered at the school gates. As he watched Liam disappear into the brick building, a profound sense of isolation would wash over him. The other kids his age were inside classrooms, learning about history and algebra, worrying about homework and schoolyard crushes. Connor's education had become one of household management, of budgeting the few dollars Derek gave them for groceries, of knowing how to treat a fever or soothe a nightmare. He was a child playing the part of an adult, and the costume was growing heavier every single day. His own school days were a fiction maintained for the benefit of social services. He hadn't attended classes regularly in over a year, a fact easily hidden by Derek's apathy. Instead of a classroom, he returned to the suffocating silence of the empty apartment. His day was a litany of chores. He washed the breakfast dishes, wiped down the counters, and tried to scrub away the grime that seemed to seep from the very walls. He would gather the dirty laundry, sorting the clothes with a methodical precision, the sharp chemical smell of detergent, a familiar part of his routine. He learned to be brutally efficient, to conquer the mess left by two careless adults, so that by the time Liam came home, the apartment would feel less like a place of neglect and more like a home. It was a constant losing battle against entropy, a desperate attempt to impose order on a world that had none. In the quiet afternoon hours, he would sometimes allow himself a moment of weakness. Tucked away in his bottom drawer, wrapped in an old T-shirt, were the only 3 photographs he had of his parents. One was from a summer trip to the coast, their faces bright with laughter, the ocean wind whipping their hair. Another was of his mother holding a newborn Liam, her smile radiating a warmth that Connor could still almost feel. The last was a family portrait, taken just months before the accident. Looking at their faces, at the easy, unconditional love in their eyes, was both a comfort and a torment. It was a reminder of what he had lost, of the safety and security that had been violently ripped away. These photographs were his most precious possession, a tangible link to a life where he was just a son, not a caretaker, a life where his only job was to be a child. The rhythm of his day was dictated by the clock on the stove. He knew he had to start preparing dinner by 4 o'clock if he wanted it ready when Liam got home. Often it was something simple, macaroni and cheese from a box, or canned soup and sandwiches, but he always made sure it was hot and that there was enough for his brother to have a full plate. This act of providing food was fundamental to his role as protector. It was a concrete way to show his love, a way to ensure that at least one of Liam's basic needs was consistently met. He moved through the familiar motions of cooking, his mind a constant buzz of logistics. Was there enough bread for lunch tomorrow? Did he remember to move the laundry to the dryer? Was Liam's reading homework on the table? He was the household's silent, unacknowledged manager, an 11-year-old, running on pure adrenaline and a desperate sense of duty. When Liam returned from school, His bright energy was like a light switched on in the dim apartment. For him, Connor would force a smile, pushing his own exhaustion deep down. He would ask about his day, listen to his stories, and sit with him at the small kitchen table to go over his homework. This was the part of the day Connor guarded most fiercely. He created a bubble around them, a space free from the tension and neglect that permeated the rest of the apartment. In this bubble, they were just brothers. They would read together, or Connor would draw superheroes for Liam to color in. It was a performance, in a way, a carefully constructed illusion of normalcy. But for Liam, it was real. He felt safe, he felt loved, and he felt seen. And for Connor, that was the only victory that mattered. The illusion would inevitably be punctured by the sound of Derek's key in the lock. He and Amber would arrive in the evening, bringing with them a cloud of exhaustion and irritability from their own lives. They would collapse onto the couch, flick on the television to a blaring volume, and the boys would once again fade into the background. They learned to navigate the evenings with caution, speaking in hushed tones, careful not to draw attention or provoke a sharp word from their uncle. Connor would finish the last of the chores, washing the dinner dishes, packing Liam's lunch for the next day, while the sound of a sitcom laugh track or a heated argument filled the small space. They were ghosts in their own home, silent observers of a life that did not include them. The final act of Connor's long day was putting Liam to bed. He would tuck him in, just as their mother used to, making sure his favorite stuffed dinosaur was beside him. Sometimes Liam would ask him to tell a story, and Connor would invent tales of brave knights and faraway galaxies, stories where good always triumphed and children were always safe. He would stay until Liam's breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep, his small face peaceful in the dim glow of the hallway light. Only then, when his brother was safely adrift in dreams, would Connor allow his own guard to drop. The exhaustion would hit him like a physical blow, a bone-deep weariness that came from carrying a world that was never meant for him to hold. He was the first to rise and the last to sleep, a small soldier in a silent, lonely war. The fragile peace of that Thursday afternoon was shattered by the most mundane of chores. The kitchen trash was overflowing, a small mountain of empty boxes and food wrappers that threatened to spill onto the floor. It was Connor's job, as all jobs were, to deal with it. He hoisted the heavy plastic bag, its cheap material straining under the weight, and carried it out into the dimly lit hallway of the apartment building. The air here was always stale, thick with the competing smells of old cooking grease from other units and the sharp chemical scent of industrial cleaner. He was halfway to the trash chute at the end of the hall when he heard his uncle's voice drifting from their apartment door, which had been left slightly ajar. It wasn't the usual loud, irritated tone Derek used when speaking to them. This was different. It was a lower, more measured voice, the kind a person uses when discussing business, and it made Connor freeze in his tracks. Something in that detached, transactional tone held him captive. His first instinct, honed by years of avoiding his uncle's temper, was to hurry past, to make himself invisible. But he couldn't move. He stood perfectly still, the rough plastic of the trash bag digging into his fingers, and listened. He heard his own name first. "Connor Miller," Derek said, the words stripped of any familiarity, as if he were reading from a ledger. The name was followed by a place, Beaverton, and a description that made no sense, a recycling depot. Connor's mind tried to assemble the pieces. A recycling depot. Was it a field trip he didn't know about? But the context felt wrong, cold and clinical. He leaned closer, his heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against his ribs, a drumbeat of premonition he didn't yet understand, but could feel in his bones. The conversation continued, and the pieces began to lock into a horrifying picture. Derek mentioned a monthly payment, a sum of money that seemed impossibly large and terrifyingly specific, $300. The number hung in the stale hallway air, a price tag attached to his name. The words that followed clarified its purpose with brutal efficiency. An arrangement had been made. He was to be sent there to work. The concept was so alien, so monstrous, that his 11-year-old mind couldn't fully grasp it at first. It was a fragment from a storybook about a different, crueler time, but Derek's voice was real. The concrete walls of the hallway were real, and the growing knot of ice in his stomach was undeniably real. He wasn't being asked. He was being reported on, an asset whose transfer had been finalized. Before he could even process the full weight of his own fate, the second hammer blow fell, and it was infinitely worse. Derek spoke Liam's name, his little brother's name, uttered with the same chilling detachment. "Liam Miller," he said, as if closing another item on an inventory list. A different place was named, Hillsborough. A different arrangement was described to the person on the other end of the line, couched in sickeningly gentle terms that only made it more grotesque. He would be going to another family, one that needed help with light yard work and cleaning. Another price was quoted for this transaction, $250 a month. The euphemism was a thin veil over a truth that now screamed in Connor's mind. They were being sold, not fostered, not sent to live with relatives, but sold into labor. The world tilted, the grimy beige walls of the hallway seeming to warp and bend around him. The buzzing of the overhead fluorescent light fixture became a roar in his ears. Sold. The word echoed in the silent chambers of his skull, a pronouncement of a sentence he never knew he was facing. He and Liam were nothing more than a source of income, two inconvenient burdens being converted into cash. The years of neglect, the indifference, the resentment, it all suddenly made a terrible, perfect sense. They were not family to Derek and Amber. They were commodities, and their value had just been realized. The trash bag slipped from his numb fingers, landing with a soft, muffled thud on the worn carpet, a sound he barely registered over the frantic pounding of his own heart. As if to erase any lingering shred of doubt, any desperate hope that he had somehow misunderstood, he then heard Amber's voice. It was higher than Derek's, laced with a giddy, undisguised relief that was more chilling than any anger. She was laughing, a small, sharp sound that cut right through him. He heard her talk about finally having the apartment to themselves again, about the extra cash every month, how much easier their lives would be without the two of them underfoot. There was no sadness in her voice, no conflict, no flicker of conscience. There was only the selfish, uncomplicated joy of people who had successfully disposed of an unwanted problem. Her words were the final nail, sealing the truth in place with absolute, horrifying certainty. But it was the next realization that truly shattered him, eclipsing the horror of being sold into labor. They were being separated. Beaverton and Hillsborough. He tried to picture the distance on a map, but all he could feel was the chasm that would open between him and Liam, the one constant in his life, the one person he had sworn to protect, the reason for every chore and every sacrifice, was going to be torn away from him. He would be sorting through metal and plastic in one town, while his 7-year-old brother was pulling weeds for strangers in another. The shield he had so carefully built around Liam was about to be broken, and he would be powerless to stop it. This was a fate worse than any hardship he could imagine enduring himself. It was the complete and utter destruction of his world. A wave of pure, animal panic washed over him. He had to get away from the door. He stumbled backward, his sneakers silent on the thin carpet, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He couldn't let them see him. He couldn't let them know he had heard. If they knew, they might speed up the timeline, they might separate them tonight. He retreated down the hall, his mind a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. He felt a profound physical coldness spread through his limbs, a deep cellular knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again. The life he had known, the difficult but stable routine he had built for his brother, had just been revealed as a temporary holding cell, and their transfer orders had just been signed. He slipped back into the apartment, closing the door behind him with a barely audible click. The scene inside was one of surreal, heartbreaking normalcy. The television was blaring a game show, and on the living room floor, Liam was lying on his stomach, meticulously coloring in a drawing of a superhero Connor had made for him. He was humming to himself, completely absorbed in his task, his small world still safe and intact. He looked up as Connor entered, his face breaking into a wide, innocent smile that trusted in the goodness of the world, a world that was anchored by his big brother. That smile was a physical blow, a devastating reminder of everything he was about to lose, and everything he had to fight to protect. In that instant, watching his brother's untroubled expression, the panic inside Connor began to crystallize into something else. The fear was still there, a frantic hummingbird beating its wings against his ribs, but beneath it, a new layer was forming, cold, hard, and sharp. It was resolve. There could be no negotiation. There was no one to appeal to. The people who were supposed to protect them were the very ones selling them off. He was utterly and completely on his own, and so was Liam. The conversation he'd overheard wasn't about a future possibility. It was the finalization of a deal already made. It was happening, and it was happening soon. He looked around the cramped apartment, at the peeling paint on the walls and the overflowing ashtrays on the coffee table. For 2 years, he had fought to make this place a home, to carve out a pocket of safety amidst the neglect. He had scrubbed the counters, washed the clothes, and cooked the meals, all in a desperate attempt to maintain a semblance of the life they had lost. Now, he saw the apartment for what it truly was, not a home, but a cage. It was a place where they had been kept until they could be sold. The realization didn't break him. It ignited something within him. An 11-year-old boy, stripped of everything, stood in the doorway of his own prison and understood, with a clarity that burned away all his childhood fears, that the only option left was to escape. The boy who had spent 2 years trying to hold his world together made the decision to shatter it in a single silent heartbeat. As he watched Liam on the floor, so beautifully and terrifyingly unaware of the precipice on which they stood, the cold panic in Connor's chest did not recede. It transformed. It hardened from a liquid fear into a sharp, clear shard of purpose. He saw the apartment not as a messy, sad place he had to maintain, but as a holding cell, a place where he and his brother were being fattened for slaughter. The realization was not a thought, but a physical sensation, a jolt that straightened his spine and cleared his vision. There was no one to ask for help, no authority to appeal to. The system had already failed them. The only path forward was out the door and into the darkness. There was no other choice. It was no longer about survival within these walls. It was about escape. His mind, accustomed to the slow, methodical calculus of chores and grocery lists, suddenly began operating at a frantic new speed. The plan that formed was rudimentary, born of desperation rather than strategy. It had only one objective: get away. Get as far away as their legs and the city's transit system could carry them. He knew they had to go west, away from the grim, industrial familiarity of Gresham, and toward the distant tree-covered hills of Portland he'd only seen in pictures. It seemed like another world, a place of wealth and quiet streets where people like Derek would never think to look for them. The timeline was just as simple and brutal. They had to leave tonight. He knew, with an instinct he couldn't explain, that waiting for morning would be too late. The deal had been made. The clock was no longer ticking, it was screaming. The rest of the evening was an exercise in excruciating tension. He went through the motions of their nightly routine, his body on autopilot, while his mind was a whirlwind of observation and calculation. He served dinner, his hands steady despite the tremor he felt deep inside. He watched Derek and Amber with a new, chilling clarity, seeing them not as his neglectful guardians, but as his jailers. He studied their habits, the way they slumped onto the couch, their attention glued to the flickering television screen, their slow descent into an evening stupor fueled by cheap beer. Their utter predictability, once the source of his quiet resentment, was now his greatest tactical advantage. He needed them unconscious, lost in a deep, oblivious sleep. That would be his window. Every minute that passed felt both agonizingly slow and terrifyingly fast, a countdown to the most important moment of his life. Under the pretense of putting away laundry, he slipped into their shared bedroom and pulled their 2 small school backpacks from the closet. They were flimsy and worn, but they were all they had. He worked with a silent, desperate efficiency. First, he retrieved the 3 photographs of their parents from his bottom drawer, carefully wrapping the worn prints in a clean T-shirt before placing them in the deepest part of his own bag. They were the only pieces of his old life he would take with him. Next, he found the small tin where he kept his savings, $15.42, painstakingly collected from loose change left on the counter over months. He zipped the money into a small interior pocket. It was a pathetic war chest for the battle ahead, but it was everything. He added a spare sweatshirt for Liam and a bottle of water he'd managed to fill from the kitchen tap without being noticed. He tucked the packed bags under Liam's bed, shoving them deep into the shadows against the wall where they wouldn't be seen by a casual glance. Then came the hardest part, acting normal. He helped Liam with his pajamas, his fingers fumbling with the buttons, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He read him a story, the words on the page blurring, his voice a strained whisper as he tried to keep it from shaking. Every sound in the apartment was magnified, the loud, canned laughter from the television, the creak of the floorboards as Amber went to the kitchen, the clink of a bottle. Each noise was a potential discovery, a threat that could bring his fragile plan crashing down before it even began. A wave of doubt washed over him, cold and sickening. Who was he to think he could do this? He was just a kid. But then the image of Liam, alone and terrified, being handed over to strangers, flashed in his mind, and the doubt was burned away by a fierce protective fire. Lying in his own bed hours later, long after putting Liam to sleep, Connor stared at the cracked ceiling in the darkness, his eyes wide open. He didn't dare to sleep. Instead, he rehearsed the escape in his mind, going over the steps again and again until they formed a clear, solid path through his fear. First, wake Liam without making a sound. Second, grab the bags from under the bed. Third, creep to the front door. He knew the lock had a particular spot. If you turned the knob just so, it wouldn't make a loud click. Fourth, walk, don't run, down the 3 flights of stairs. Fifth, head straight for the Max light rail station 4 blocks away. He repeated the sequence like a prayer, a mantra to ward off the paralyzing terror that threatened to swallow him whole. He took one last look around the shadowy room, a silent farewell to the only home he'd known for 2 years. He wasn't leaving a home, he was leaving a prison. The signal came just after 2 in the morning. The drone of the television in the living room finally went silent, plunging the apartment into a deeper, more absolute quiet. A few minutes later, he heard the muffled sounds of Derek and Amber stumbling to their bedroom, followed by the definitive click of their door closing. He lay perfectly still, listening, his entire body a single, focused nerve ending. He counted the seconds, stretching them into minutes. He waited until he could hear the low, rumbling sound of his uncle's snoring begin, a steady, unbroken rhythm that was the auditory proof of his unconsciousness. This was it. The silence he had been waiting for had arrived, a heavy, suffocating blanket under which he could finally move. There was no more time for thinking, no more room for doubt. The point of no return had been reached, not with a dramatic confrontation, but in the dead, quiet stillness of a sleeping apartment. He slid from his bed, his bare feet making no sound on the thin, worn carpet. The air was cold, and he could feel a tremor in his hands, but his purpose was a solid core of heat inside him. He crossed the small distance to his brother's bed and knelt down, his shadow a long, distorted shape in the faint moonlight filtering through the window. He put his hand on Liam's small shoulder and shook him gently, willing him to wake without a sound. "Liam," he whispered, his voice barely audible, a puff of air in the profound silence. He had to make his 7-year-old brother understand the impossible, that they had to leave everything they knew behind and walk out into the night. "Liam, wake up," he whispered again, more urgently this time. "We have to go. We have to leave right now." In that moment, he wasn't just a brother, he was a rescuer, and the life he was trying to save was sleeping peacefully right in front of him. Liam's eyes fluttered open in the darkness, wide with confusion. Connor pressed a finger gently to his own lips, a universal sign for silence that his brother understood instantly. He saw the question in Liam's gaze, the sleepy fear, and he leaned in close, his breath warm against his brother's ear. He didn't have time for a full explanation, only the most essential truths. "We have to play a game," he whispered, the words tasting like a lie but feeling like a lifeline. "A quiet game. We have to be spies and leave the house without anyone hearing us." He watched as Liam's fear was slowly replaced by a flicker of sleepy excitement, his absolute trust in his older brother overriding the strangeness of the situation. Connor's heart ached with the weight of that trust, a fragile, precious thing he was now carrying out into the cold, unknown night. It was a burden and a fuel, the very reason he could find the strength to move. With Liam now awake and silent, Connor moved with practiced stealth. He slid the two backpacks from beneath the bed, the slight scrape of the nylon against the dusty floorboards sounding like a gunshot in the stillness. He helped Liam slip his small arms through the straps, then shouldered his own bag, the meager weight of their entire world settling on his back. He took one last sweeping glance at the room, at the faded dinosaur wallpaper and the single, grimy window, and felt a surprising pang of something that wasn't quite sadness. It was the feeling of a chapter closing, a final, definitive goodbye to a life he had fought so hard to endure. He took Liam's hand, the small fingers instantly curling around his own, and with a silent, steadying breath, he led his brother out of the bedroom and into the dark hallway, leaving their past behind them one quiet footstep at a time. The front door was the first great monster. Connor knew its secrets, the specific way the deadbolt would groan if turned too quickly, the loud click the latch made if you didn't hold the knob just right. He approached it like a bomb disposal expert, his movements slow and deliberate. He held his breath, his ears straining for any sound from his uncle's room. Hearing only the steady, rumbling snore, he began the delicate operation. He turned the deadbolt with excruciating slowness, wincing at the faint metallic scrape. Then, holding the knob tightly, he turned it and pulled the door inward just enough to slip through the opening. The first breath of cold, 2A, emerald air hit his face, sharp and clean and tasting of freedom. It was a shocking contrast to the stale, smoky atmosphere of the apartment, a tangible sign that they had crossed a threshold into a new and terrifying reality. The 3 flights of stairs in the apartment building's common hallway felt like a treacherous mountain descent. Every step was a gamble. Connor held Liam's hand in a vice-like grip, guiding him to walk on the very edges of the stairs where the old wood was less likely to creak. The air was thick with the smell of old carpet and disinfectant, and the only light came from the dim, yellow emergency fixtures that cast long, distorted shadows on the walls. With each landing they passed, Connor's heart hammered a little faster. He imagined a door opening, a neighbor stepping out, a voice demanding to know what 2 little boys were doing out so late. But the building slept on, oblivious. They were ghosts, slipping through the cracks of the world, their silent passage a testament to their own invisibility, a quality that had once been a curse, but was now their only salvation. Stepping out of the building and onto the deserted sidewalk was like stepping onto another planet. The city at night was a vast, empty stage, eerily silent, except for the distant hum of the freeway and the lonely buzz of a street lamp overhead. The familiar street, usually bustling with cars and people, was now a canyon of dark windows and parked vehicles. For the first time, the sheer scale of what he was doing crashed down on Connor. He was 11 years old, leading his 7-year-old brother into an abyss. A wave of paralyzing fear washed over him, so potent it made his legs feel weak. He looked down at Liam, who was staring up at the starless, orange-tinged sky with a look of quiet wonder. That look was enough. Connor tightened his grip on his brother's hand, the fragile determination returning, and took the first step away from the only home Liam could remember. The 4 blocks to the Max station stretched into an eternity. The cold night air was a physical presence, seeping through their thin jackets and chilling them to the bone. Connor walked with a purpose he didn't feel, trying to project a confidence that might somehow fool the shadows. He kept his eyes scanning the empty streets, his ears tuned for the sound of an approaching car or a shout from a darkened window. Liam, sensing his brother's tension, stayed close, his small steps struggling to keep pace. "Are we going on an adventure, Connor?" he whispered, his voice a small, hopeful puff of white in the cold. "Yes," Connor replied, the word catching in his throat. "A really big one." He focused on the rhythm of their footsteps on the cracked pavement, a steady, desperate beat, carrying them forward, away from the past and toward a future he couldn't even begin to imagine. Suddenly, a pair of headlights sliced through the darkness, pinning them in a harsh white glare. A car was turning the corner, moving slowly down the street toward them. Panic seized Connor. Without thinking, he yanked Liam's arm, pulling him off the sidewalk and into the narrow, garbage-strewn gap between 2 buildings. They pressed themselves against the cold, rough brick wall, holding their breath as the car rumbled past. The engine sounded deafeningly loud in the silence. Through the gap, Connor could see the driver's silhouette, a faceless stranger completely unaware of the two fugitive brothers hiding just feet away. The car continued down the street and disappeared, plunging them back into darkness. Connor leaned his head against the brick, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his teeth. They were so fragile, so exposed. One wrong turn, one curious glance, and it would all be over. They reached the light rail station, a lonely island of sterile light in the dark expanse of the neighborhood. The platform was deserted, the digital sign announcing the next westbound train in 6 minutes. 6 minutes felt like a lifetime. Connor led Liam to the ticket machine, its screen casting a blue glow on their anxious faces. He pulled the small handful of change from his pocket, his fingers clumsy with cold and nerves as he fed the coins into the slot. $15.42. He bought 2 youth fares, the machine spitting out the thin paper tickets with a whirring sound that seemed impossibly loud. He clutched the tickets in his hand. They were their passage out, their proof of purchase for a one-way trip to nowhere. He felt a small, bitter victory. He had provided. He had gotten them this far. The distant rumble grew louder, followed by the sight of the train's single, bright headlight cutting through the gloom. It arrived with a screech of brakes and a pneumatic hiss as the doors slid open, an invitation into a warm, brightly lit world. Connor didn't hesitate. He pushed Liam ahead of him and scrambled aboard just as the warning chime sounded for the doors to close. They found seats near the back, sinking into the hard plastic with a shared, unspoken sigh of relief. As the train began to move, pulling away from the station with a smooth electric hum, Connor felt the first real flicker of hope. They were moving. They were escaping. Every foot of track they covered was another foot of distance between them and Derek, between them and the life that had been chosen for them. He watched the familiar, bleak landscape of Gresham slide by the window, a movie of his past, playing in reverse. The initial relief of being on the train soon gave way to the crushing weight of exhaustion. The adrenaline that had fueled Connor for hours began to recede, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. He looked over at Liam, whose small face was pale in the harsh fluorescent light. His brother's initial excitement had faded, replaced by a quiet fear. His lower lip began to tremble. "I'm scared," Liam whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I want to go home." The words were a knife in Connor's chest. He pulled his brother closer, wrapping an arm around his small, shivering shoulders. "This is better than home," Connor said, forcing a strength into his voice he didn't feel. "Remember how Mom and Dad always said we were a team? It's just us now. We're our own team and we're going somewhere safe." He was speaking as much to himself as to Liam, a desperate incantation against the darkness. As the train rattled on, Liam's head grew heavy on Connor's shoulder, his fear finally giving way to sleep. Connor stayed awake, his gaze fixed on the passing city. He watched as the landscape changed, the squat industrial buildings of the east side, giving way to the glittering vertical towers of downtown Portland. The train plunged into a tunnel, and for a moment, all he could see was their reflection in the dark glass. 2 small lost figures huddled together, their faces etched with a weariness that didn't belong on children. He saw the reflection of the backpack at his feet and remembered the photographs tucked inside. It was a tangible link to a time when they were safe, when they were loved unconditionally. That memory was all he had left of a real home, and it was the compass he was now using to navigate the terrifying, open ocean of their future. The train emerged from the tunnel and began its slow, rumbling journey across the Willamette River. Below them, the dark water reflected the city lights like scattered jewels. It was beautiful and terrifying, a world of wealth and power that felt utterly alien. He had no plan, no destination. The idea of heading to the West Hills had been a vague, desperate impulse, a desire to hide in the rich, quiet neighborhoods he imagined were the opposite of everything he had ever known. Now faced with the reality of it, the flaws in his logic were glaring. Where would they go? What would they do? He was just a boy with $14 and a sleeping brother, heading toward a place where they didn't belong. But turning back was not an option. Forward was the only direction that existed, no matter how uncertain or frightening the path ahead might be. They disembarked at a station at the very edge of the city, where the urban grid began to give way to the steep, winding roads of the hills. The air here was different, colder and cleaner, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. The silence was deeper, broken only by the chirping of crickets. The real journey was just beginning. Connor looked up at the dark, tree-lined road that snaked upward into blackness. It looked like the entrance to a fairy tale forest, one full of monsters. He gently shook Liam awake, and together they began the long, arduous climb. Each step was an effort, their legs aching, the straps of their backpacks digging into their shoulders. They walked for what felt like hours, moving deeper into the darkness, guided only by a desperate hope that somewhere in these silent, opulent hills they would find a place to hide, a place to rest, a place to simply be safe until the sun came up. The climb was a slow, punishing march into nothingness. For what felt like an entire lifetime, but was likely only a few hours, they had been moving upward, away from the distant, indifferent glow of the city, and into a profound, consuming darkness. The air grew thinner and colder, scented with the sharp, clean fragrance of pine and damp earth, a smell so alien from the stale, smoky air of their apartment that it felt like the atmosphere of another world. Connor's legs were twin pillars of fire, each step a negotiated truce with the screaming muscles in his calves. Beside him, Liam stumbled more than walked, his small hand a cold, dead weight in Connor's own, his occasional whimpers swallowed by the vast, uncaring silence of the hills. Hope had dwindled from a flickering candle to a single stubborn ember, and Connor was beginning to fear it would be extinguished entirely, leaving them stranded in this cold, hostile wilderness until the sun rose to expose them. It was when he was certain they could not take another step that he saw it. Through a gap in the towering ancient trees that lined the winding road, a silhouette appeared, a jagged shape against the faintly lightening pre-dawn sky. It was a roofline, vast and complex, with chimneys that looked like skeletal fingers reaching for the heavens. As they drew closer, a high stone wall emerged from the darkness, covered in a thick, suffocating blanket of ivy. Following the wall, their hands brushing against the cold, damp stone, they came to a pair of immense wrought-iron gates, rusted into a permanent, forbidding frown. The name on a corroded bronze plaque was almost illegible, but Connor could just make out the letters, Whitmore. The estate was a sleeping giant, a forgotten kingdom that seemed both a fortress and a tomb, and in its menacing grandeur, Connor saw the one thing he craved more than warmth or food, a place to hide. Desperation fueled a frantic search for entry. The gates were an impassable barrier, chained and padlocked with a heavy, ancient-looking lock that had long ago surrendered to rust. They followed the stone wall, their fingers tracing the cold mortar, searching for any weakness, any crumbling section they could climb. But it was built to last, a monument to a forgotten family's desire for privacy and security. Just as the last of his energy was about to give out, as the cold began to seep into his very bones, Connor's foot slipped on a patch of slick, dead leaves, and he fell near the foundation of the wall. It was from this new lower vantage point that he saw it, a small rectangular void of perfect blackness near the ground. A basement window, its glass long since shattered, leaving a jagged, gaping mouth that promised a way inside. It was a terrifying invitation, but it was the only one they were going to get. Getting inside was a trial of cold and fear. Connor went first, his mind refusing to consider what might be waiting for them in the darkness below. He carefully cleared the larger shards of glass from the sill, his fingers clumsy and numb with cold. The opening was painfully narrow, scraping against his ribs and the thin fabric of his jacket as he squeezed through. For a terrifying moment, his backpack snagged, and he was stuck, half in and half out of the suffocating blackness. With a surge of panic-driven strength, he twisted and pulled, tumbling the last few feet and landing hard on a cold, unforgiving concrete floor. The air in the basement was thick and stagnant, heavy with the smell of damp earth, mildew, and the slow, patient decay of time. He called up to Liam in a harsh whisper, and then, with his brother's trust as his only guide, he reached up and carefully helped him through the opening, pulling him down into the subterranean darkness of their new temporary world. For a long moment, they simply stood there in the absolute blackness of the basement, listening to the frantic sound of their own breathing. The silence was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered all outside noise. The chilling wind that had pursued them up the hill was gone, replaced by a still tomb-like cold that seemed to emanate from the stone walls themselves. This was their first small victory. They were inside. They were out of sight. The immediate threat of discovery had receded, leaving only the unknown terrors of the house itself. Connor's eyes slowly adjusted, the faint light from the broken window revealing the hulking, indistinct shapes of forgotten furniture and stacked boxes, all shrouded in cobwebs that hung like tattered funeral veils. He took Liam's hand, the small fingers trembling, and led them away from the window, deeper into the heart of the sleeping giant. They found a set of wooden stairs that creaked in protest under their slight weight, ascending from the musty darkness of the basement into the main body of the mansion. The scene that greeted them was one of majestic, sorrowful decay. They were in a grand foyer, its checkered marble floor coated in a thick, uniform layer of grey dust. A monumental staircase swept upwards into the gloom, and from the high ceiling, a crystal chandelier hung like a frozen waterfall, its prisms dulled by years of grime. In the vast adjoining rooms, furniture lay hidden beneath white dust cloths, their draped forms resembling a congregation of silent, waiting ghosts. Moonlight filtered through the tall, grimy windows, cut through the darkness in ethereal beams, illuminating swirling motes of dust that danced in the still air. It was clear that no one had lived here for a very, very long time. The house wasn't just empty, it was forgotten. The sheer scale of the mansion was intimidating, its grand, empty spaces feeling more exposed than the wooded road outside. They needed a small room, a defensible space where they could feel safe enough to finally rest. They crept up the main staircase, their footsteps swallowed by a thick runner of carpet that was surprisingly preserved beneath the layer of dust. The second floor was a long hallway lined with closed doors, each one a potential mystery, a potential threat. Connor felt like an intruder in a fairy tale, a peasant boy who had wandered into the enchanted castle of a sleeping king. But his exhaustion was a far more powerful force than his fear. He pushed open the first door he came to, peering into a cavernous master bedroom, its massive four-poster bed draped in white, looking more like a mausoleum than a place of rest. It felt wrong, too large and too grand. They continued down the hall, their quest now simple and primal. Find a bed that felt small enough to be safe. It was the third door on the left slightly ajar, that led them to their sanctuary. The room was instantly different from the rest of the house. It was smaller, more human-sized, and though it was covered in the same blanket of dust, it felt less like a museum piece and more like a place where a life had actually been lived. The walls were adorned with faded posters of planets and spaceships and a collection of swimming trophies, their gold plating now a dull, tarnished brown, sat on a wooden shelf. A single bed was pushed against the far wall, its covers a mess of dinosaur-patterned sheets. In that moment, seeing the familiar childish pattern, a profound sense of relief washed over Connor. This wasn't a guest room or a master suite. It was a child's bedroom. It was a space that, despite being abandoned for over a decade, felt knowable, less haunted by the ghosts of adults. This, he knew with an instinct he couldn't explain, was where they would be safe. The sight of the small, unthreatening bed was the final signal Liam's exhausted body needed. The tension that had held him upright for hours finally released, and he practically collapsed onto the mattress, curling into a tight ball without even bothering to get under the dusty covers. Within moments, his breathing deepened into the slow, steady rhythm of profound sleep. Watching him, Connor felt a wave of fierce, aching love. He had done it. He had gotten his brother out. He had found them a shelter, a place where, for at least a few hours, the world could not reach them. The weight of his responsibility lifted just enough for him to breathe, and he carefully draped a thin, dusty blanket over Liam's small, still form. The silence of the room settled around him, a silence that felt different from the menacing quiet of the rest of the mansion. Here it felt peaceful, protective. With Liam finally safe in the harbor of sleep, Connor allowed his own curiosity to surface. He moved quietly around the room, his fingers tracing lines in the thick dust on a wooden desk. An old beige computer monitor sat on its surface, a relic from another era. He ran his hand over the spines of the books on the shelf, adventure stories and science encyclopedias. He was seeing the ghost of a childhood, the remnants of a boy who had lived in this room, a boy who liked dinosaurs and swimming and outer space. His eyes were drawn to the desk drawers. He tried the top one, which slid open with a soft groan, revealing nothing but dried-up pens and a handful of paper clips. He tried the wide central drawer next. It was locked. A small, simple lock, the kind used for diaries or private boxes, not for real security. The sight of it sparked something in him, a quiet, insistent curiosity about the boy who had once slept in this bed. He took one of the paper clips from the top drawer and, with a focus that pushed away his own exhaustion, began to work it into the small keyhole. He had seen this done in movies, a simple trick that suddenly felt like the most important skill he had ever learned. The house was utterly silent. The only sound, the faint rhythmic whisper of Liam's breathing, and the tiny metallic scratching of the paperclip against the lock's inner workings. His fingers were cold and stiff, but he persisted, driven by an inexplicable need to know what was inside. After a few moments of patient probing, he felt a faint click, a small, satisfying sound that echoed loudly in the stillness. The lock had given way. He paused, his heart beating a little faster, a strange mix of trepidation and anticipation welling up inside him. He was about to uncover a secret that had been waiting in the darkness for 16 years. He pulled the drawer open slowly, the wood scraping softly against its frame. It was almost empty, save for a single object resting in the center. It was a book, about the size of his hand, bound in dark brown leather that was worn smooth at the corners. It felt heavy, important. There was no title on the cover, no markings of any kind. He lifted it out, the cool, supple feel of the old leather, a surprising sensation against his grimy skin. He carried it over to the bed and sat down gently on the edge, careful not to wake his sleeping brother. In the pale grey light of the approaching dawn that now filtered through the dirty window, he opened the cover. On the first page, written in the elegant, looping cursive of someone taught penmanship in a way he never was, were 3 words that seemed to bridge the impossible gap of time. Timothy Whitmore, age 10. And so, it was here, in the heavy silence of this forgotten bedroom, where dust motes danced like ghosts in the slivers of moonlight, piercing the boarded-up windows, that Connor Miller arrived at the moment our story began. He sat on the edge of the small creaking bed, the air thick with the scent of old paper and decay, a smell that clung to the dinosaur-patterned sheets and faded posters on the walls. Curled beside him, his 7-year-old brother Liam breathed the deep, even breaths of exhausted sleep, oblivious to the world that had cast them out. In Connor's trembling hands, he held the leather-bound diary, its pages filled with the elegant, looping cursive of a boy from another time. He turned to the first entry, dated 1996, and began to read the words of a stranger, completely unaware that in doing so, he was about to find a reflection of his own sorrow, a shared heartbreak that would give him the strength to face the uncertain dawn. The first few pages of the diary were a chronicle of a life that was, on its surface, the complete opposite of Connor's. Timothy wrote about horse riding lessons, summer trips to Europe, and the sheer overwhelming size of the mansion he called home. But underneath the descriptions of material wealth, a deeper, more familiar story began to emerge. It was a story told in the negative spaces, in the things that were absent. He wrote about eating dinner with the housekeeper in the vast, empty dining room, his father, James, once again delayed by work in the city. He described the echoing silence of the long hallways at night, a silence so profound he would sometimes talk to himself just to hear another voice. Connor felt a strange and powerful kinship with this boy from the past. He recognized the specific ache of a childhood spent in the shadow of adult indifference, a loneliness that no amount of money or privilege could soothe. As he read deeper into the entries from the fall and winter of 1996, the tone grew more desperate. Timothy's parents were divorcing, a fact he seemed to have pieced together from hushed phone calls and the sudden, prolonged absence of his mother. His father, now his sole custodian, became even more distant, a ghost who communicated through brief formal notes left on the kitchen counter. Timothy's world, like Connor's, had been fractured, the foundations of his security crumbling away. The elegant cursive described his attempts to connect, leaving drawings on his father's desk or waiting up late in the grand foyer, hoping to catch a glimpse of him returning home, only to be met with the quiet disappointment of an empty hall. Each word was a small sharp pinprick in Connor's own heart, a recognition of the universal need to be seen by the people who are supposed to love you most. The final entry was dated December 21st, 1996, just 4 days before Christmas. The handwriting was slightly shaky, the loops of the letters tighter, as if written with a hand clenched by a desperate hope. It was short, only a few lines, but it held the weight of 1,000 unspoken pleas. Timothy wrote that his father had promised, truly promised, to be home early that night to decorate the enormous Christmas tree in the main hall. He described how he had spent all afternoon carefully laying out the boxes of ornaments, his favorite ones polished and ready. The entry ended with a sentence that shattered Connor's composure completely. "I hope he doesn't cancel again for work. I just want him to see me." In that raw, simple plea, Connor saw the reflection of his own desperate fight to shield Liam, his own yearning for the parents who could no longer see him, and that is why he began to cry. The tears that fell were not for his own hunger or fear. They were not for the cold, uncertain future that lay ahead of them. He wept for Timothy Whitmore, a boy he had never met, separated by 16 years of silence and dust. He wept for the shared secret language of lonely children, for the quiet heartbreak of a promise that he felt, with a crushing certainty, had likely been broken. He was mourning a childhood that, despite its opulent setting, was just as stolen as his own. The diary wasn't just a book, it was a testament. It was proof that the ache in his own chest was not his alone, that another boy had stood in this very house and felt the same profound emptiness. He gently closed the leather cover, a silent promise passing from his heart to the ghost of the boy who had written it. He would not let Liam ever feel this way. His quiet grief was abruptly shattered by a sound from downstairs, a sound so alien and unexpected it made the air in the room feel thin and sharp. It was the distinct metallic scrape of a key, turning in a lock, followed by the deep, groaning complaint of the massive front door swinging open on rusted hinges. Terror, cold and absolute, seized him. Someone was here, the owner, a caretaker. It didn't matter. They were caught. His mind raced, a frantic search for an escape route, but there was none. They were on the second floor of a sealed fortress, and the intruder was already inside. He looked at Liam, still sleeping peacefully, blissfully unaware of the new immediate danger. Connor's body went rigid, every muscle tensed for a confrontation he knew he could not win. He held his breath, listening to the soft, measured footsteps that now echoed in the grand foyer below. The footsteps were not heavy or menacing. They were light, deliberate, and they moved with a strange familiarity through the cavernous space. They paused at the bottom of the grand staircase, and for a heart-stopping moment the entire house was plunged back into a profound silence. Connor imagined a figure looking up into the darkness, perhaps sensing their presence. He wanted to run, to hide, to somehow make himself and his brother invisible, but he was frozen in place, a cornered animal waiting for the inevitable. Then, the footsteps began again, this time ascending the stairs, each soft tread on the dusty runner, a hammer blow against his ribs. He couldn't breathe. This was it, the end of their desperate, fleeting freedom. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs, turned down the hallway, and stopped directly outside the bedroom door. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a silhouette against the dim light of the hall. It was a woman, perhaps in her 50s, with a kind, tired face that was etched with a deep, familiar sorrow. She held a single, long-stemmed white rose in one hand. Her eyes, adjusting to the gloom, fell first on the small sleeping form of Liam, and then on Connor, who was sitting bolt upright on the bed, his face a pale mask of terror. The woman's expression was not one of anger or alarm, instead a wave of shock, followed by an unreadable, profound sadness, washed over her features. She looked at the two boys in her son's old bed, at the dinosaur-patterned sheets and the faded posters on the wall, and her gaze seemed to soften, to fill with a pain that was ancient and deep. She took a small, involuntary step back, her hand rising to her mouth as if to stifle a gasp. "Timothy," she whispered, the name a fragile, broken thing in the silent room. It wasn't a question directed at him, but a memory that had been jolted to the surface. Connor, still paralyzed by fear, could only shake his head, his throat too tight to form words. He clutched the leather-bound diary to his chest like a shield. The woman's eyes fell to the book in his hands, and a flicker of pained recognition crossed her face. Her gaze then returned to Connor, and she seemed to truly see him for the first time. Not as an intruder, but as a terrified child. She saw his grimy face, the exhaustion in his eyes, and the fierce protective way he instinctively leaned closer to his sleeping brother. The hardness of her initial shock melted away, replaced by a wave of pure maternal compassion that was so palpable it seemed to warm the cold air in the room. Over the next hour, in hushed, halting sentences, Connor recounted their entire story. He spoke of the neglect, of the overheard phone call, of the desperate flight into the night. He explained how they had found the mansion, seeking only a safe place to hide until morning. He told her about finding the diary, his voice breaking as he tried to explain the connection he felt to the boy who had written it. The woman, who introduced herself as Catherine Whitmore, Timothy's mother, listened without interruption. She sat on an old wooden chair, the forgotten white rose resting in her lap, her eyes never leaving Connor's face. She didn't question him, didn't doubt him. She simply listened, her expression one of deepening empathy and a sorrow that seemed to understand his own completely. She was not a threat. She was a witness. When he finally fell silent, the story told, Catherine's eyes were glistening with unshed tears. She told him that she came to the house once a month, a private pilgrimage to a place that was now more of a memorial than a home. Then, her voice soft with a grief that 16 years had not managed to erase, she told him the rest of Timothy's story. He hadn't just been lonely. A few months after that final, heartbreaking diary entry, he had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of leukemia. He had passed away in the summer of 1998 at the age of 12. His father, James, consumed by a guilt that his money could not cure, had never recovered. He had fled the country during the financial crisis, leaving the house and everything in it to her, a perfectly preserved monument to his grief and their shared loss. Connor stared at her, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with a devastating finality. The loneliness he had felt in these pages was just the prelude to a much greater tragedy. He wasn't crying for a boy whose father didn't show up for Christmas. He was crying for a boy who never got to have another one. He looked at Catherine, a mother who had lost her child, and he understood the source of the profound sadness in her eyes. He had stumbled into her private sanctuary, a place of sacred memory, and yet she was looking at him not with anger but with a fierce, protective compassion. In that moment, he realized he wasn't just a trespasser in a stranger's house. He had inadvertently found the one person in the world who could possibly understand the depth of his own fight to protect his brother from being lost. Catherine reached out and gently placed her hand on his arm. Her touch was warm and steady, a grounding force in the swirling chaos of his emotions. She told him that what he had done for his brother, the courage it had taken to run, was an act of profound love. She looked at the sleeping form of Liam, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Connor felt the crushing weight of his responsibility begin to lift, transferred to the care of this kind, sad-eyed stranger. She promised him that she would help, that she would make sure they were safe, and most importantly, that she would not let anyone separate them. It was a simple promise spoken softly in a dusty, forgotten room, but for Connor, it was the sound of the entire world shifting back onto its axis. He didn't know then the full extent of what her help would mean. He didn't know that she would make a single, powerful phone call to the head of Oregon's Child Protective Services, using an influence she rarely wielded to demand that their case be handled with the utmost urgency and care. He didn't know that her intervention would trigger an investigation that would swiftly uncover Derek's embezzlement of their survivor benefits, a betrayal that went far deeper than mere neglect. He didn't know that their uncle would lose custody permanently and face a battery of criminal charges, his world of selfish indifference finally and irrevocably shattered. All Connor knew in that moment was that this woman, a mother still grieving her own lost boy, was looking at him and Liam and seeing two children who deserved to be saved. The relief that washed over him was so immense, it was almost painful. It was a physical sensation, a dam breaking inside his chest, letting loose a flood of emotion he had held back for 2 long years. The tears he cried now were different. They were not tears of grief for a boy in a diary, or tears of fear for his own future. They were tears of pure, unadulterated release. He had carried the weight of their survival on his own small shoulders for so long, and now finally someone else was offering to help bear the load. He had walked into this mansion seeking a temporary refuge from a world that had forgotten him, and instead he had found the one thing he had stopped believing existed: an adult who cared. The first rays of morning sunlight were beginning to pierce through the grimy windows, cutting through the dust-filled air and illuminating the room in a soft, golden light. It was the dawn of a new day, the first day of the rest of their lives. Connor looked from Catherine's compassionate face to his brother's sleeping one, and he felt a profound sense of peace settle over him for the first time since the snowstorm on Interstate 84. He had kept his promise. He had protected his family, and in the process he had found an unlikely angel in a house of ghosts, a guardian who would guide them out of the darkness and back into the light. The escape was over. The rescue had just begun. The days that followed were a blur of quiet offices, gentle questions, and the steady, reassuring presence of Catherine Whitmore. She became their advocate, their shield against a system that could have easily swallowed them. She used her resources not with a sense of charity, but with the focused determination of a mother protecting her own. She found them the Morrisons, a foster family in the leafy suburb of Lake Oswego, a couple renowned for their unwavering commitment to keeping siblings together. The first time Connor walked into their warm, brightly lit home and saw the 2 adjoining bedrooms prepared for him and Liam, he felt a sense of stability so profound it almost brought him to his knees. It was a home, not a holding cell, a place built on kindness rather than obligation. 5 years have passed since that fateful night in the Whitmore Mansion. At 16, Connor is a tall, thoughtful teenager who carries a quiet confidence that was forged in the crucible of his past. Liam, now 12, is bright and energetic, his childhood memories of neglect thankfully blurred, overshadowed by the years of love and security he has found with the Morrisons. Catherine remains a constant in their lives, a figure they have come to call their honorary aunt. She visits every other weekend, bringing with her stories of Timothy, sharing his memory not as a source of sadness, but as a celebration of a life that, in its own way, helped save theirs. The mansion still stands on the hill, a silent, sleeping monument, but it is no longer a place of fear in Connor's mind. It is a symbol of the moment their lives turned. When Connor turned 15, the Morrisons, who had come to love the boys as their own sons, offered to formally adopt them. It was a gesture of ultimate belonging, an invitation to finally and completely put the past behind them. In a decision that showed a maturity far beyond his years, Connor, after talking it over with Liam, respectfully declined. He explained that they wanted to keep their parents' surname, Miller, not out of a rejection of the Morrisons' love, but as a way to honor the memory of the family they had lost. It was a quiet declaration of identity, a way of saying that their history, with all its pain and loss, was still a part of them, a foundation upon which their new life was built. It was the final definitive act of a protector, ensuring his family's legacy would endure. Their victory was not loud or dramatic. They did not become poster children for the foster care system or the subjects of a sensational news story. Their triumph was quieter, more personal, and infinitely more profound. It existed in the small, everyday moments of a normal life, in the shared laughter over dinner at the Morrisons' table, in the easy companionship of working side-by-side stocking shelves at the local bookstore where they both have part-time jobs, and in the simple, unspoken comfort of knowing that, at the end of the day, their rooms are right next to each other, that they are safe and together. Connor fulfilled the promise he made to himself in that dusty, silent bedroom. He had navigated them through the darkest of nights and delivered them to a peaceful shore. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, Connor will stand in the doorway of his brother's room and watch him sleep. He no longer feels the frantic, desperate weight of being the sole protector. Instead, he feels a deep, abiding sense of peace. He sees not a fragile child he must shield from the world, but a strong, happy boy on the cusp of his own life, a life full of possibilities that were once unimaginable. He kept his family together. He kept his brother safe. In a world that had tried to tear them apart and sell them for parts, he had proven that their bond was priceless. The greatest treasure he had found in that abandoned mansion was not a secret fortune or a hidden clue, but the simple, unwavering strength to hold on to the only thing that ever truly mattered: